Thanks to MPB for sponsoring this video. Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my full review of the Canon RF 24mm f1.8 Macro IS STM, a wide-angle prime lens for the EOS R mirrorless system aimed at landscape, architecture, vlogging and close-up work. Announced in July 2022 alongside the RF 15-30 zoom, the RF 24 1.8 costs around $599 or £719. Note that it only works with EOS R mirrorless cameras and is not compatible with EOS DSLRs or EOS M cameras. While a number of RF zooms already include the 24mm focal length, the RF 24 1.8 actually becomes Canon's first prime lens to deliver this coverage in the native format. Sure, you can adapt a wealth of older 24s designed for the EF mount, but this is the first native RF 24 prime from Canon. If you're thinking about buying a new lens, it's always worth seeing if there's a used or older version in good condition, or whether you can sell one that you don't need anymore to offset some of the cost. Either way, I head to MPB to find out. MPB is the world's largest online platform for used photo and video gear, so if you have any kit that you're not using anymore, just head over to their website for an instant quote. For example, at the time I made this video, MPB offered me £245 for an old Canon EF 24mm 2.8 IS-USM lens in excellent condition. They're also a global platform operating across Europe and the US. MPB's quote also includes free doorstep pickup, and once they receive and confirm the condition of your gear that you're selling, you can choose to accept the quote and receive the money in your account the next day. No post office, hidden fees or disgruntled buyers to deal with. Or if a previous version is good enough for your needs, try searching MPB for a used model. I found the older non-stabilised EF 24mm 2.8 actually one of the very first lenses I bought for my film EOS 5 on MPB for £154 in good condition. I've been using MPB for several years now and I've always had a positive experience with them. So when you have photo gear to buy, sell or trade, I'd recommend checking them out at mpb.com or using the links in the description. Right, back to the review. Interestingly, for its first RF 24, Canon's chosen to pitch it within its more affordable series, or at least sub 1000 range, leaving an inevitable higher end L version for the future. Indeed, at the time I made this review, Canon's EOS R system remained surprisingly low on L series primes, with only 150 and 285s in the double digit range. In contrast, the RF 24 1.8 becomes the fifth lower cost prime under 100mm in the series, joining existing 16, 35, 50 and 85 models, although revealingly it is jointly the most expensive in this group. I think it's safe to assume that Canon's RF catalogue will eventually offer every focal length that you desire in both relatively lower cost and high-end versions. But in the meantime, I do feel that the system would be more attractive if Canon opened up the mount to third parties in order to fill any gaps and provide alternatives, not just in terms of price, but also specification. Anyway, back to the RF 24 1.8, which roughly slots between the RF 16 2.8 and 35 1.8 in terms of coverage and design, being closest of all to the 35 in size and features. Indeed, at 74 by 63mm and weighing 270 grams, the RF 24 1.8 is the exact same size as the 35 1.8 and only a few grams lighter. Both share the same barrel design too, with a 52mm filter thread, clicky customizable control ring, smooth free spinning manual focus ring, metal lens mount and separate switches for optical stabilization and manual focus. Now, having a dedicated switch for manual and autofocus may sound like a pretty standard feature for a lens, but it's sometimes absent on the cheapest models, including Canon's own RF 16 and 50mm STM. Both of those force you to enter the menus in order to select manual focus, which if you do that often can be frustrating to say the least. While some EOS R bodies, like the R7, now include their own AF/MF switch, it remains useful to have on the lenses, and a feature that makes the RF 24 and 35 a step up over the cheapest RF models. That said, don't assume any further luxury here, as you're still not getting weather sealing or a lens hood with any of these non-L lenses. In terms of optics, the RF 24 1.8 has 11 elements in 9 groups, 9 diaphragm blades, optical stabilization, claiming up to 5 stops of compensation by itself, or 6.5 on bodies with IBIS, and a closest focusing distance of 14 centimeters. Like Canon's other lower price lenses, the focusing is driven by an STM motor, which extends the inner barrel a little bit in use, taking any mounted filter with it for the ride. You're going to hear it if you're recording with built-in microphones. Here it is focusing between subjects with the aperture wide open to f1.8 using a single AF area on the EOS R6, where you can see that it's smooth and confident, albeit not exactly the fastest tool in the box. Indeed, compare the speed to the RF 24-105 STM here at 24mm and you'll see the zoom lens can actually focus visibly faster, although it also has a maximum aperture that's over 2 stops dimmer, so the depth of field isn't anywhere near as shallow or challenging. Now here's the same test with the RF 24-1.8 but for video, again wide open at f1.8 and filming 4K on the EOS R6. Canon's AF system easily pulls focus between the subjects here smoothly and confidently. Once again though, the focusing motor will be audible if you're using in-camera mics. And now for the RF 24-105 STM at 24mm f4, again showing a similar focus rack between the two bottles that's smooth and confident for video. Now I've muted the sound on both of these clips as there was background noise while I was filming, but the zoom's motors are essentially silent in operation. In terms of focus breathing, here's the RF 24-1.8 manually focusing from infinity to the closest distance and back again. As you focus closer, note the change in magnification becomes quite visible. Just compare it to the RF 24-105 STM zoom here at 24mm, again manually focusing from infinity to the closest distance, and you'll see much less of a change in magnification due to breathing. But remember, the zoom can't focus as close as the prime here, so if I show them focusing between the same distance range of infinity, but this time to around 20 centimeters and back again, you'll actually see that their change in magnification is roughly similar. Okay, next for coverage, starting with the RF 24-1.8, and to put it in perspective, here's the RF 16-2.8 for comparison, before switching back to the 24, and then switching to the RF 35-1.8 from the same position, and finally back to the 24. Each lens of course has its place, but for me 24 is one of my favourite focal lens, wide enough to grab a big view, but not so wide that you have to worry about distortions too much. It's also perfect for vlogging and product presentation videos, as you'll see throughout this review. Like most modern lenses, the RF 24-1.8 employs a profile to compensate for geometric distortion and vignetting. You'll notice distortion correction is greyed out and always applied for in-camera JPEGs in the menus, so you don't need to do anything to get it to work. If you're processing RAW files, most converters will also apply the profile by default, but within here you also have the opportunity to turn it off to see just how much is being corrected behind the scenes. So here's the coverage again from the 24-1.8 STM with the profile applied, before switching to a version processed without the profile. And as I toggle between them, you can see the corrections taking place. For comparison, here's the RF 16-2.8 STM switching between versions with and without its profile, where you can see the corrections are much more substantial, going beyond a mere stretching in the corners. But compare them to the RF 35-1.8 STM with and without its profiles here, and you'll see this lens requires the least correction of the three lenses, although to be fair, it's also the least wide in coverage. Since profiles are a part of modern lens design, I'm personally at peace with them as they allow designs, performance and pricing that were previously impossible or out of reach in some other respect. And they're academic too for most owners as they're generally applied by default, so you don't need to worry about anything. Now in my reviews, I do like to show you what's going on behind the scenes just for reference, but for the rest of this review, I'm going to show you images and videos that all have profile corrections applied, as this is how the lens is designed to be used. So let's start with my distant landscape test, angled so that details run into the corners, allowing us to judge the sharpness across the entire frame. As always, I'm presenting results with the lens focused in the middle of the frame, as this is normally how you'd shoot a distant landscape scene, and it also allows you to judge the flatness of the field. I shot all these tests using the original EOS R body, and I'm going to start with a closer look at the middle of the frame, with the aperture wide open at f1.8. I'll introduce crops from the RF 24-105 STM kit zoom for comparison at f4 onwards. So here's the RF 24-1.8 with the aperture wide open, where the middle of the frame looks pretty good to me with a decent degree of real life detail. As you close the aperture, you will enjoy a small boost in contrast and overall crispness, arguably peaking at around f4. And this is where I'll introduce the RF 24-105 on the right, shot moments apart, and here also set to 24mm f4. I'd say there's little to tell them apart at f4, nor closed one stop further to f5.6, so a good result for both lenses here in the middle of the frame. Now back to the RF 24-1.8, presented alone with the aperture open to f1.8 before heading into the far corner. Here you'll see some softening of ultimate detail, along with some darkening due to vignetting. Gradually closing the aperture to f4 sees a mild improvement in sharpness, but mostly a lifting of that vignette. At this point I can put the 24 prime result on the left and the 24-105 zoom result on the right, with both lenses set to f4. Now, as this is the maximum aperture for the zoom on the right, it's not surprising to see it suffering from more darkening in the corners due to vignetting, and the 24 prime on the left is a tad crisper at this point too. Closing both to f5.6 sees mild improvements, with the prime still enjoying a small edge, and there's still a small gap between them at f8. Note that I also reshot both lenses with the focusing area moved right into the same far corner, and I didn't really notice any benefit to doing this, so both fields are fairly flat. So the RF 24 1.8 prime is a little bit sharper than the 24-105 zoom in the far corners at the same apertures, but I wouldn't describe their relative performance in this test as reason to buy one over the other. The real benefits of the RF 24 1.8 over a kit zoom are its brighter aperture and closer focusing, so let's take a closer look. To illustrate this, let's start with a portrait shot with the RF 24 1.8 with the aperture wide open at 1.8, and even from this distance, looking at the whole image, there's a nice degree of separation from the background. Taking a closer look shows there's also plenty of detail around my eyes, which the Canon bodies make easy to capture thanks to effective face and eye detection. 24mm is not only ideal for environmental portraiture, but also a great focal length for presenting pieces to camera, as long as you don't get too close to the lens. You can see the 24 prime in action here, mounted on an EOS R6, using face and eye detection again to track me around the frame. Now let's put the 24 prime at 1.8 on the left and the 24-105 STM zoom at 24 f4 on the right, and you can see straight away the impact of the larger aperture on the prime lens, allowing much shallower depth of field effects and greater separation from the background. The broad coverage, large aperture and close focusing capabilities of the RF 24 1.8 also make it the perfect lens for product presentation videos. Here I have the R6 on a tabletop tripod positioned about 80 centimeters away at one end of a standing desk, while I present from the other side. Notice not only how well the R6 is focusing this lens, but also how close this lens can focus to the subject. And if you're interested, that's a Sony f717, one of the many classic vintage digital cameras you'll find on my retro YouTube channel Dinobytes. Check it out. The presence of optical stabilization also makes handheld filming easier, especially when used along IBIS as seen on the R6 here, although again you may hear that focusing motor when recording with the built-in mics. To be fair, it's not exactly loud, but it's not silent either, so it's best used with off-camera mics or for silent B-roll. Now let's take a closer look at the quality of the blurring with my ornament test against some fairy lights, starting wide open at f1.8 of course. There's decent sized bokeh blobs here, and while there's also some outlining to them, they do manage to minimise that distracting onion ringing pattern inside. As the aperture is closed, the blobs begin to lose their elongated cat's eye shape and become more rounded, albeit influenced by the shape of the 9-blade diaphragm system. Here's the 24 1.8 on the left and the 24-105 STM on the right, both with their apertures close to f4 where the blobs are similarly sized, but obviously with the different influences of their respective aperture systems. Now at f4, the zoom lens on the right is actually at its maximum aperture versus the prime on the left, which has already been closed by over 2 stops, and that's why they have different shapes. Open the prime on the left to its maximum aperture f1.8 though, and you'll see the difference that's possible from the same distance. But this isn't quite the end of the story, as both lenses have additional capabilities. Now I shot this first macro bokeh ball test at the closest focusing distance of the 24-105 STM zoom in order to make a direct comparison, but of course the 24mm prime can focus even closer. So here it is from its closest focusing distance, where f1.8 you can enjoy a very shallow depth of field effects if that's what you're after. But so far I've only been comparing the 24-105 at the same 24mm focal length, so in the spirit of flexibility, here's what it will deliver when the zoom is set to 105mm. Now I've had to move further back in order to focus, and the aperture is also close to a maximum of f7.1 at this point, but it does show a different kind of perspective and bokeh blob style that you may prefer. Sticking on the subject of close-ups, Canon describes the RF 24 1.8 as a macro lens, although like the RF 35 1.8 and 85 f2, it's only capable of 50% magnification or 1 to 2 reproduction. Now many close-up enthusiasts prefer to reserve the macro term for 1-to-1 reproduction or even greater, which in the current RF series is only offered by the 100mm f2.8L macro lens, a much higher end model that I've also reviewed if you're interested. But 50% magnification or 1 to 2 reproduction still allows for decent close-ups as shown throughout this review, and while I'll share a few more examples in just a moment, I did want to first photograph a ruler as close as I could focus the lens. Here you can see it's actually captured 67mm across the ruler, which represents a fraction greater than 50% magnification on a full-frame sensor. It's a good result for the 24, but to achieve this you will need to shoot from just 14cm from the sensor plane, which runs the risk of casting shadows on your subject. The RF35 1.8 is only a little better in this regard, delivering 50% magnification from 17cm, but the RF85 f2 is more practical, achieving its 50% magnification from a distance of 35cm. Either way, the ability to focus pretty close is a useful addition to the RF 24mm 1.8 for both stills and video alike. Now before wrapping up, one last result for you showing the 24 1.8 with its aperture closed to the minimum value at f22, where point sources of light are rendered with diffraction spikes. There's 18 of them here from the 9-blade diaphragm system, and while they're not exactly the sharpest spikes around, you can still achieve some nice effects. Which now brings me to my final verdict, during which I'll show you a selection of images shot with the RF 24 1.8 mounted on an EOS R and R6 body. As always, if you'd like a closer look at any of them, you can access the original images via my reviews at cameralabs.com. Canon's RF 24mm 1.8 Macro IS STM is a compact, light and well-featured wide-angle lens for the EOS R mirrorless system that's capable of decent results from distant landscapes to close-up details. It's fairly sharp into the corners, can deliver nice shallow depth of field effects with its f1.8 aperture, and while not a true one-to-one macro lens, the ability to achieve 50% magnification will still be close enough for most of us. The addition of optical stabilization and an AF/MF switch also rank it above Canon's cheapest models. As a non-L lens from Canon, it's not surprising not to have weather sealing or a lens hood as standard, but it's still disappointing, especially given the price of this lens. After all, the 24 1.8 may be pitched as one of the more affordable prime lenses in the RF system, joining the earlier 16, 35, 50 and 85 STM models, but it's also one of the most expensive in this group, roughly matching the RRP of the 85. As such, it lacks the no-brainer low pricing of the 16 and 50 STM, while also being beaten by the 35 STM, not just on price but quality too. So if you're flexible on focal length and simply want to add a general purpose prime to your collection, there are cheaper options. And again, that RF35 1.8 is a little better corrected to start with. But if you want or need a 24mm prime in the native RF mount with a large aperture, it's literally the only game in town, at least at the time I made this review. While a higher end L version is almost inevitable in the future, one hasn't even appeared on the roadmap yet, and at the time of testing there's no third-party options with AF. The only alternative is to either adapt to an older EF lens or adjust one of the many RF zooms to deliver the same field of view. And speaking of which, if you are willing to trade aperture for the flexibility of a zoom, do also consider the RF 15-30 that was launched alongside it at a slightly cheaper price. Ultimately, while it's neither their sharpest nor most affordable lens, I still enjoyed using the RF 24 1.8. I personally loved this focal length for both photos and video, and found the close focusing and image stabilization gave the Canon extra flexibility. My personal favourites in this part of the series may remain the 16 and 35 models, but I always have room for a 24 in my bag, and the 1.8 STM is a solid option again for stills and video work. Let me know what you think of the RF 24 1.8 and whether it's the lens that you've been waiting for. And don't forget to check out my other reviews of RF lenses, as I've done almost all of them. If you find any of them useful, please do consider subscribing to my channel, and if you absolutely love them, there's links in the description to shout me a coffee or treat yourself to my in-camera photography book or perhaps a Camera Labs t-shirt. And thanks again to MPB for sponsoring this video. If you have any photo gear to buy, sell or trade, check them out at mpb.com or using the links in the description. See you next time. Bye bye.